Everybody, welcome to JavaScript, the new parts. Before we get started, I need to ask, who in here is a Java developer? Okay, who in here has used JavaScript? Who in here is just a JavaScript developer? All right.
Man, those are some good questions. You got 100% or 0%
It's good.
on all of them.
So we targeted our audience to you guys specifically, and so I think this will work out good. Go ahead.
So, yeah, let's get started.
So I'm the guy on the bottom, and he's the guy on the top. No. Sorry. So my name is Joshua Wilson, and I've been a Java developer. I need to stand over here for the camera. Yeah. So I'm Joshua Wilson. Can't even talk anymore. You can see my Twitter handle up there. I've been with Red Hat for about 5 years now. I'm an application developer. I've been doing JavaScript for a number of years because every time we build some web app, nobody else on the team wants to do JavaScript, and I don't mind, so I end up writing the JavaScript. I'm actually getting to a point now where I'm only writing JavaScript. I'm not writing Java anymore. I can still do it. But I actually like JavaScript. Don't hate me. So that's me.
And I'm Michael Clayton. I joined Red Hat about three and a half years ago, and about 5 years ago, I decided to take a break from Python and Cold Fusion and focus on JavaScript for a while, and kind of got stuck on it, and I've actually been enjoying it more and more the longer I do it.
All right, before we get into the talk, I need to give you guys a little context. Without that, some of this stuff won't make sense. So I don't know how many of you actually understand the history of JavaScript, but I'll give you the short version. Brendan Eich wrote it in '95 for Netscape. He called it Mocha, and it took him about 10 days to come up with this fantastic language. 10 days. So he'd done some stuff in the past that kind of was easy enough for him. All right, so they went through some updates and some iterations, and then they settled on the ECMA as a standards body, and they called it ECMAScript under ECMA, and then they came out with a couple of releases. And then they were working on ECMAScript, or ES4 at the time, and it had a lot of changes and a lot of improvements, but the body that was working on it couldn't all agree on it, and so then they eventually abandoned it. That's why it's X'd out, and we don't have an ES4.
That was around 2004, I think? Something like that?
Yeah, I think so. And then they came out, eventually the body got back together after everybody kind of abandoned it, and came out with ES5, which is sort of just a little bit of an improvement over ES3. And that kind of sat for a very long time. And a lot of the things that are in ES4, and some new things, if you've ever heard of CoffeeScript, some of the features in there and other things that have come out over the years, were put together into ES6, or actually ECMAScript 2015. That's the actual title, but most of us just call it ES6 because we're too lazy to call it ECMAScript 2015. From now on out, they're going to be doing minor releases as we go.
So the specs will continue to come out. In general, ECMAScript just refers to the specification, and JavaScript refers to the browser implementations or engine implementations.
And actually, we can use ES6 today.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, but it's finally here.
It's in, if you got the latest Chrome, latest Firefox, or Microsoft Edge, it can handle about 99% of what's in ES6. So you can use that all right now, if you're using the latest browser.
So today we're going to take you on a kind of a survey of ES6. There's too much in it to cover in one talk, but we're going to highlight some of the most powerful features, the ones that really make your lives easier. And we're going to be showing you kind of common code from ES5 or before, and then contrast it with the brand new power that ES6 gives you, and show you some much cleaner, easier to understand code. So
from here on out, it's just code. It's going to be before and after, so good contrast. So no more bullets.
No more bullets.
All right, so start off with something simple. We're going to do a strings in standard ES5 JavaScript. We have two different ways to make strings with quotes. You can either do single or double quotes, and that's so that you could wrap HTML because it needs quotes in there, and so when it was created, it had that. And if you want to add variables in there, it's just a standard concatenation using the plus to add it together. We do that in Java all the time with strings. This is normal. So that's what we do with ES5.
Yeah, and that's not too bad, but especially if you have a lot of variables that you need to inject into a string, it starts to get a little hairy. So in ES6, we have this brand new thing called a template string. And I don't know if you guys can see it, but var message at the bottom, it doesn't have single quotes or double quotes. It actually has backticks, the key right above,
key above
tab.
Yeah. With the tilde?
Yeah, and you can inject variables into your strings when you're using the backticked template strings by using the $ curly brace. Put your expression in there, your variable name, whatever you want, and you get the string.
So in this view, it doesn't look like it's that big of a deal, but when we get into something a little more complicated, go ahead. We have here some building out some HTML that is going to be inserted on the fly dynamically, and I'm referencing an object with an array and then the data points inside, and we're still just doing string concatenation. And the bigger you have to deal with this, the more annoying it is. So ES6 cleans it up.
Yeah, with ES6, we're including the references to those array elements and object properties inside the curly braces. And it looks a lot cleaner. It looks more like what you're shooting for than when your view is cluttered up with quotes and concatenations. And another thing you guys might notice about this is there's line breaks in there, in the middle of that string.
That's helpful for us. In old JavaScript, if we wanted to add line breaks for the source file, you'd do it with /n for the new lines. There's a sort of a hack you can get away with. You can escape those, and then you can leave off the concatenation. But it's still a mess. It's not fun to write it like that. So the ES6 syntax is better.
Much better. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to clutter up with escaped ends and escaped actual new lines. You just put your returns in there, and this helps a lot when you're trying to debug your application. Like if this was some HTML that you were generating, and it wasn't showing up quite right, so you needed to actually look at it, print it out in the console. You want it to be formatted. It's really tough to look at if it's all on one line. So just printing this out, it's going to look exactly like it looked in your source file where you declared it.
Nice. All right. When you're dealing in Java, this is one of the big things that people dislike about JavaScript is that it doesn't have types, and then the variables are just really weird compared to Java. And so in this syntax, I'll walk through it so we can all be on the same page with it. We've got the variable x, which is going to be 3, and then you've got a function that's going to take a Boolean in this case, and then check to see if it's true or false. And if it's true, then we're going to return a randomized number, and if it's not, it should return 3. But when you run this, it returns undefined. And the reason for that, next slide, is that there's something called hoisting, or at least that's what we call it, where the variable that we created with the math random is actually block scoped inside the function scoped. And then it takes that and creates another variable inside the function. And so then when you run the function, if you don't get inside the if statement, you're hitting var x is nothing, it's undefined, and so you return x is undefined. So you're not hitting that outside one. And so that kind of trips people up whenever they use JavaScript early on before they figure out how the variable hoisting works.
Yeah, it's really weird, and it's led to this pattern. A lot of JavaScript developers will just put every single var statement they have at the top of the function.
I do it.
Just to be clear, just so it's immediately clear where the variable is being declared, because you don't want your declaration being moved and the assignment staying in the same place. It leads to code that's harder to follow. But fortunately, in ES6, we have this brand new keyword called let. There's also const, which I'll get to in a second. But what let is a pretty good proxy for var. Like they're about the same. The main difference is that let is scoped to the block that contains it. So the curly braces, the closest curly braces that match it, or sorry, that surround it, that's where that variable exists. It's not function scoped. It's not purely function scoped. It's just scoped to any block that it's inside of. So this let x inside the if block only exists inside that if block. It's not going to get hoisted out.
So when you run this, the return x, if you've sent in a false, it's going to actually hit the let x3 on the outside because there's no definition for it in the visible scope of that return. So it's a little clearer, and it kind of takes away some of the ambiguity of it.
Yeah, and it kind of makes you feel cool like you're a mathematician using let x equals 1.
You're not already cool?
No, not yet.
Oh, okay. So const.
Yeah, const follows all of the same rules as let. It's block scoped. It's not hoisted. The one difference is that once it's been assigned, it cannot be reassigned. That doesn't mean that it's immutable. It means that the reference is immutable, but if it's pointing to an object, that object can still be changed. Like you can see here, we declare some object, const some object with this property a. We can still change a, but we cannot change what some object is pointing to.
So just like in JavaScript, in Java, that's passed by reference, not passed by value, JavaScript does the same thing. So if you've got an object, you can change the underlying content of it. Const is very similar to final in Java, except the one difference is that in Java, you can declare your final variable at the top and then assign it someplace else, and then it's stuck as a final. In JavaScript, wherever you declare it, you have to assign it at the same time. So that's the only difference, but otherwise it works pretty much the same.
Before I move on, is everybody able to read this okay? Is it a good size? All right, great. And just as a side note, this isn't specifically an ES6 feature, but if you do want a completely constant immutable object, you can wrap your object in object.freeze.
Just freeze it.
None of the properties can be changed. The configuration can't be changed. It's completely fixed. Moving on.
All right, so everybody in the room is a Java developer. I shouldn't have to describe a standard for loop. I hope. Everybody, for loop, we're good? Okay, for loop. This works the same way in JavaScript as it does in Java. Just iterate over it. I'm pulling out things from the array. In this is all the way back from way long ago. In ES5, they added a for each method to the array. So then I can just go in and pull out each element as I want and then display those, including the index.
Yeah. And
the problem with this is that you can't hit a break anywhere. So it's going to run through the whole array. So if you want to stop the loop, you can't.
yeah. So in cases where you do for sure want to touch every element of the array, this
Works
is a
good.
great way to do it. It's very concise, and it's not prone to off-by-one errors for the index-based for loop. So this is a new addition of ES6, the for of loop. And this allows you to loop through any object that is iterable. Arrays are iterable, also maps and sets, weak maps, weak sets. There's a lot of options, and you can make your own custom objects iterable as well. And this is just a great way to do it, and
It has an advantage.
it has a great advantage. You can break.
You can break in this.
Yep.
There's another advantage in this. You hit the next one?
Yeah.
Index.
So for the for each, you get access to the element itself and the index of the element, which is really handy sometimes. And you don't lose that ability with for of. You can still get that with this pattern here. You can get the index and the element.
All right, what do we got next? Functions. I'm not going to get into all the mess that functions, how they differ from Java. But essentially, inside of the array, there's a map function, and I can pass a function into that function. And this is an anonymous function that's just going to square. So I'm going to square everything that's in there, and the map is going to create a new array and put it into something called squares. This is pretty typical in JavaScript.
And That's not too bad, but these new arrow functions are sometimes called fat arrow functions.
It's a lot cleaner.
They use that equals, greater than operator. To the left of that is the parameter. You can have multiple parameters if you want, but here we just have one. And to the right of that arrow is the return value. So you don't have to use the function keyword, you don't have to use the return keyword, it's all implied, and it's just much more concise.
It also fits better with a functional programming paradigm when you wrap things up like that.
Your eyes have to do a lot less scanning with this.
Yeah.
But that's not all.
So one of the problems with Java developers, I ran into this, so it's natural. This, the keyword this, in Java functions differently than this in JavaScript, because this in Java references the instance of the class that you're creating. In JavaScript, it's the calling class or object or whatever context that's calling the method that we're in, and so it kind of throws everybody for a loop. So the way you get around this, when you want to reference the outer this in an inner function, is to rename it self, and then you can call it whenever you want.
Yep.
And so then when we get into this button and the function that we have nested in there, I have to use that self toString to get the outer one, otherwise it's going to reference the wrong thing.
Yeah. If we used this right here, it would reference the button, not the UI component.
So this is very typical in JavaScript.
Yeah. Maintaining a reference to the
Still annoying.
object that you wanted is sometimes hard. And it gets a little bit easier, but it really never gets comfortable. There's constantly times where I'm looking at a function and it's hard to figure out what this refers to sometimes. Since you can rip a function off of one object and apply it to a different object, you can't do that in Java. At least, I don't know how.
So things get better.
Yes, arrow functions make this much, much easier. One of their other differences, besides the syntactic conciseness, is they don't have their own this scope, or this reference. So this arrow function here, even though it's a function, it still has a reference to this, meaning the UI component. So we don't have to preserve a reference to the UI component by using var self equals
That's
this.
a key distinction between a regular function and an arrow function. So if you want to have your own this and reference it that way, then you need a regular function.
More functions.
Yeah. This is a common syntax structure. Because of how JavaScript handles true and false and things that are sort of true and sort of false, and it just wants to think of things Booleanish. If you don't pass in the X and Y, like we see the call down here at the bottom with the move, then it's going to think that those are false-y or false-ish. So then when you hit this assignment, it goes, well, the first thing, I don't know what it is, so it's therefore false. And the OR statement says, well, that's false, I'll give you the other one. And so it's a way of doing defaults. And this has become a very typical pattern throughout JavaScript to have these defaults. And then once you've got it assigned, it'll just take those zeros and pass it out.
Yeah, and you'll see this all the time. Lots and lots of people use this.
What's ES6 give us?
ES6 gives us the defaults specified right there in the function area, or the parameter area of the function declaration, right where it belongs. So you don't have the downside of an extra line of code for every single function parameter. And you also don't have to worry about cases where if you were to call move and pass in something that evaluates to false, like an empty string or null, you've actually provided a value, but it's still treated as false, and so it turns into 0. Yeah. And that's not always what you want.
All right, sometimes we want to return more than one thing. And so here we have an array that passes in two literals. We could pass in variables, and normally, you can only return one thing, so here our one thing is just an array. And then you can see how we're accessing it. You call the method, and you've got an instance of it, and then you can just use the index 0 or 1 to get the first or second elements out of that array that you got. That's kind of normal.
Yeah, it's not too bad, but kind of like the last example, it's an extra line of code for each value that you want to extract. And so ES6 provides this so-called array destructuring statement, where it doesn't have to be const, it could be let, it could be var, but the array brackets are actually around the variable names. And what that does is take the x, which is in the 0 position, and the return value of 1 gets assigned to x, and y is in the 1 position, and so the other return value gets assigned to that. So we wind up with x equals 1, y equals 2, just like we wanted, one line of code.
A lot cleaner.
Yeah.
Same thing, but this is objects. Note the curly braces instead of square brackets, and so we're dealing with field values. So x is going to be 1, and so I can then reference it with dot notation.
Yeah, and this is about the same, just an object instead of an array. And this is object destructuring. It's the
Very
same
similar.
idea. Yeah.
Different braces.
Yep, curly braces instead of square brackets. And the one other difference is while array destructuring is order-based, x and then y, this is key-based or property name-based. So the x here has to, or the x here rather, has to match the object that's being returned.
So I put a in there.
If you put a in there, it would be undefined.
Doesn't work.
Simple enough?
If you guys have questions, please let us know.
Oh yeah, anytime.
Just go back a slide, please. So it seems like your function, the key names in your function can interfere with the method that's calling that function. Where you're forced to use those key names. It seems like that function has decided to use x as a key.
Mhm.
Now when you're deconstructing it, in a thing called function, you have to use key x as a variable name, even if you might have already used it.
So if you wanted a different variable
Let's
name.
repeat the question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So I want to make sure I understand the question. So you're saying say it one more time so I can repeat it concisely?
I think so the function x,
Oh, he's got a mic for you.
Fancy.
so, I don't know if this is working. Hello? Okay, it is working. So the function the function getXY has decided to name the keys x and y.
Yeah.
So then the thing that calls that function, when it deconstructs it, it doesn't seem to have any choice. It's forced to use the same
Yes.
keys x and y, which it may already be using in that scope.
Right.
So-
I believe there is a way. I think you can do, instead of just x comma y, you can do x as, and then give the variable name that you want to use.
Assign it to something.
Yeah.
X
your own
as
name.
my x, y as my y.
Right, because it sounds like you're breaking encapsulation otherwise, because the function needs to be aware of what's calling it, which doesn't
Yeah.
seem right.
Yeah. So you do still have to be aware of what the schema of that object is, but you can assign it to a different variable name if
Okay.
it conflicts with your local scope.
Yeah, that makes sense. But obviously, sensible default is not to, because it's likely not to. Yeah.
Definitely.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yep. So named parameters is a concept that's been around for a while in regular JavaScript. This is a follow-on to the default idea. And here we're having the options object, and then you assign it names, and using the same OR syntax, you can give it some defaults. And how we use this is that I don't want to have to know or fill in every single variable that I have to pass in. I can just reference the step here and change it to a 2, and I don't have to worry about the other ones because they're defaulted because of how it's set up. And this has a lot to do with what we just saw before.
Yeah, and this is a very popular pattern because it gives you two huge advantages. One is for a function that takes a lot of parameters, you don't have to ensure that they're specified in the right order when you call that function. And additionally, in the location where you're calling that function, you see the actual name of the parameter right in front of you, so you don't have to remember, like, oh, okay, like the 7th parameter of this function, what is that again? It says null, but I don't remember what that means. So this helps you a bit with that. And also optional parameters,
Yep.
like you said. This gets a lot easier with ES6. This is, you might recognize the object destructuring. we're taking this object in step 2 and destructuring it in the function parameter space here to get start, end, and step, and also using
A lot easier to look at,
parameter
to see.
defaults.
You don't have to hunt down through the whole method to understand it.
Yep.
Much easier.
Yep. And you don't have to have that boilerplate code at the,
Yeah.
at the top of the function body.
All right, one of the things that as a Java developer I kind of expect to see everywhere is a signature. So when I create my function, and with overloading and overriding, signatures are very important in Java. In JavaScript, there's no concept of a signature. Given a method, I can pass in n number of arguments, and it doesn't complain about that. It may not work when it takes those arguments and uses them inside. If you're not expecting any, it'll ignore them. And if you are expecting some and you send in the wrong ones, the insides I'm not really worried about. How it handles this, though, there's this unknown invisible arguments array-like thing that I can treat like an array. And here I'm doing that. So the mymax doesn't have anything in the arguments, but down here on the bottom you can see I'm passing in 2 different lists of numbers. And so I pass those in, and then I can use arguments to iterate over those and then find the max value in that. So that's how we do it in old school JavaScript.
Yeah. And this is, it's kind of clumsy using the arguments object.
It's hidden.
It's hidden, and even though it looks like an array, it has numbered indices and it has a .length property. It doesn't have the rest of the object prototype, so you cannot do for each on it, for example, map,
So it's
reduce,
limited.
etc. It's very limited. And there's also no indication in the function declaration, the first line of the function declaration. In the parameter space, there's nothing. So if you were looking at this function, in order to know that it accepts any number of parameters, you have to actually inspect the body of the function to figure that out.
That's annoying.
Very annoying. Your IDE cannot help you here.
Question.
Yep.
Yes?
If you don't pass any parameters, it will throw a no pointer exception.
It would just return negative infinity, I think.
JavaScript doesn't do null pointer exceptions. That's a benefit of Java.
Yeah, yeah. The arguments object will still exist even if there's no arguments. It just won't have,
It'll just be empty.
any indices, yeah. So in ES6, we have this rest operator, ... And what that does is convert a set of function parameters into an array. So down here where we call mymax 1, 2, 3, that's not an array, it's just a sequence of parameters. But inside the function body, we have access to numbers, which is all of the arguments, put into a nice array for us so we can use all of the array prototypes, and it behaves more naturally. And we also get the benefit of seeing right there in the parameter location that it's expecting numbers. It's expecting a list of numbers.
A lot more understandable this way. All right.
More magic.
If we need to specify the specific first variable, and then the ones that come after it are n number, this is the pattern we do. It's sort of a hack, but that's how you do it in standard JavaScript. But in ES6,
In ES6, we can specify the exact number of parameters where you specify parameters. So we have pattern, and after pattern, we have any number of arguments, and those will be put into an array. The one limitation on this is the ... args, the rest args, has to be at the end. It has to be the last
thing.
argument. Otherwise, there's no way to know where to stop, or where to put the bounds.
Is the arguments keyword there, is it now a first-class system where you can do this type of things on it now?
I don't think the arguments object has been changed. As far as I know, it still behaves the same way that it always has. But there's just a lot less need to use it now that you can be a lot more explicit with the rest parameter.
is what the rest parameter is what?
It is an
Yes,
array.
the rest parameter is an array. All right, going off of what we've been dealing with, now we have this.
This is like the opposite of REST.
So to take the method that we created that did the max, finding the max of something, you pass in comma delimited variables or numbers. But if I have an array and I want to pass that in, the way it works in JavaScript is you have to do the apply to it. And so I'm just passing in the temperatures and apply and pass that in. It doesn't really, it's not intuitive, but that's how it actually works. So if I want to apply an array directly to it. So we can use ES6.
Yeah, it looks weird. It doesn't look like you're even calling the myMax function. You're calling a function attached to that function. And that first parameter, the empty object, just looks strange. So in ES6, we're able to use, it looks like the same operator, ... but here we're using the ... in the, at the invocation point, not at the declaration point.
So it's called a spread.
It's called a spread here. And so we're able to take an array and essentially turn it into a sequence of function arguments.
What else we got? All right, so this is just taking it a step further. If I want to use the same apply and then add one array to another array, I'm just going to apply and then push it in. So I can take, and you can see how it adds up all of them together. That's pretty typical on how you want to build up or combine two arrays.
Unions. So in ES6, we can use the spread operator here as well. This will mutate the array 1 instead of returning a new one, but it'll take the elements of array 2 and push them individually onto array 1. If we didn't have the ... here, we would wind up with the whole array 2 as one element of array 1. So we would have A, B, and then an array
Subarray.
of C and D, subarray.
Oh, the fun part in JavaScript, constructors.
This is everyone's
and
favorite.
Prototypes. All right. In normal Java, we pass in the variables and setters and getters and all that stuff that we do to set up the object when you instantiate it. This is how you do it in JavaScript. So you're going to create your variables that you want, and then they get passed in, and that's what is on that thing that is sort of a class in JavaScript. I mean, it is object-oriented, but it's not really class-focused. It's prototypical. And if you want a method applied to the class, then you have to use the prototype of that class object function, and then you can apply, in this case, get description, which is really just a two-string for simplicity's sake.
And this is uncomfortable for a lot of people for two reasons.
Especially for Java developers?
Yeah. One is this function event, it doesn't say anywhere that it's a constructor. There's no constructor keyword letting you know that this can be used to create objects. It's just sort of implied by the use of this and adding .name and .location to this.
Can you fix this?
Essentially instance variables. And the other thing is that get description is kind of detached.
Yeah.
That's not part of
a different file.
Yeah, it could be in a totally different file. But we have now this fancy new class syntax. This doesn't actually change the object-oriented model. It's still prototype-based, but it gives you this like wonderful syntax that's a lot more familiar and intuitive.
That I recognize. Yeah, that's good.
So get description is part of class event, clearly, and the constructor is clearly labeled as a constructor.
Much nicer. As you said, that's just syntax sugar. It doesn't change anything underlying, just something to make it easier to work with.
But it doesn't make just that easier.
No, this is even harder. So whenever you want to subclass something, now to get the person, or employee being a subclass of person, I then have to create do an object create, and I have to grab the prototype of the person and apply that to the employee prototype, and go through the constructor and the describe, and then I can reference person call in here. It's a mess.
Does anybody like this?
Not me.
It is pretty gross.
This is used everywhere, though. That's how JavaScript is written.
Yeah, yeah.
But this is how JavaScript can be written.
Now we just have simple extends. It's as easy as that. Class employee extends person. And then inside those functions, we have access to super and all of super's class methods.
Much easier. One of the areas that got a little weird the last way was something, if I've created a person and then I created an employee, I can merge them together using prototype. But in the built-in methods like error, this is a hack, really. And this is actually used because this is really the only way to do it. But I still have to do the object create and then pull in the error prototype. But then I've got to go in and I've got to apply it, and then I've got to create a copy of it, and it's just a mess.
Yeah. It's rough, but it doesn't have to be rough. Now all you have to do is
That's
extend
easier.
the built-in.
I like that.
So error and quite a few of the other built-in objects can all be extended. We don't have a complete list here, but most of them can be.
I like it. All right. In Java, we have the namespaces that help us distinguish what is where and who can talk to what. In JavaScript, it's all one file. I don't know if you guys know this, but it's just one long file. That's all the JavaScript ends up being.
Even if it's multiple files,
It still has to be one
basically
file
one
at the
file.
end.
Yeah.
So a while back, they created a in JavaScript, they created the module revealing pattern, which is what we're looking at here. It's a way of separating things out
Yeah.
so that we can distinguish between them.
It wraps these do something functions inside the my module namespace.
Yep.
This is all right. It's pretty good. It didn't require any language extensions or libraries. You can just use it. But it's got drawbacks too. The namespace can't be changed, and it doesn't deal with dependencies at all.
So some libraries were created, actually a bunch of libraries.
Yes, a lot of them.
The
So this one is AMD,
Yeah, AMD.
Asynchronous module definition. This one does require a library in order to use. It's not a language level construct. But you are able to declare dependencies at the top, and at the bottom in the return statement, you can provide the API that your consumers will use.
This
And-
has been around for a while.
Yeah,
And
it's
there's
been-
another one that's
been around
becoming
for a
even
long
more
time.
common. It's been around for almost as long.
Yeah, Node.js has really popularized this module system a lot. CommonJS, where you use require to pull in your dependencies, and you use module.exports to reveal your API.
In this one, if you want to use it, it's been in Node.js, which is server side. If you want to use it in the browser, then you use something like Browserify. And you can use this style.
Yeah, there are plenty of options for that. But pretty soon, we won't have to rely on any of these third-party, like huge myriad of module systems. ES6 has a very nice module system built in.
It's very similar to Common.
Yep, you put your imports at the top, misspelled dependency, but please overlook that. And then you use export at the bottom or within to reveal your API.
There is a downside to this one.
Yeah, unfortunately, the browser support for this doesn't exist yet.
It's really the only feature left to be added to the browsers. But if you use any of the build tools or transpilers like Babel or Tracer, you can then use the module pattern.
Yeah, and it's well worth using.
Yeah.
I'm completely confident this is going to become the de facto module system. The other ones aren't going away, but ES6 modules are just going to keep growing and keep getting more.
Yes, sir.
Oh,
The question was, what is the default keyword?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I keep forgetting. The default keyword means that this is the only object that's being returned from the module. The alternative is we could put
Name them.
export function do something. If we put export right here in front of the function, then it would export do something else. I kind of like the default pattern though, because it just shows to anyone inspecting your code, they can see in one spot everything that's being exported, rather than being kind of peppered within the file. Did that answer the question? Cool.
my team produces developers.red.com. Is it safe for us to move to ES6? Or
Okay, so the question is it safe to move to ES6? And that depends on your audience. If you've got an audience using old IE, you can absolutely move to it, but then you need to use a transpiler like Babel or a tracer. If you are confident that your audience is using the latest browsers, then you don't need to deal with the transpilers. So it depends on what your target audience is. But yeah, you can absolutely use it now, and just on the safe side, just transpile it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's kind of why I said my audience. There's some people that we're aiming at developers, right? So a lot of my developers do come from IE. A lot of them are kind of the 9 to 5 corporate developer.
I would transpile it.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
I think that'll help. This is our last slide with some reference information.
So the two transpilers that Joshua just mentioned, whoa, I don't know what that did.
Hit the wrong key.
There we go. The S key does something. Babel and Tracer here are two transpilers that will convert, if you write your source code in ES6, they will convert it into ES5. And they're able to do that kind of by going in reverse of what our presentation does. They take the bottom right and convert it into the top left. And there's only a couple of ES6 features that cannot be implemented in ES5. One that we didn't cover is tail call optimization.
Which we're not going to get into.
Yeah,
right
we won't get into that. But you get pretty much every ES6 feature available, and you can support older browsers if you use either of these.
So if you're wanting to learn some things, the Mozilla, whenever you want to search up anything on how it works, the Mozilla site's pretty thorough. And then Dr. Axel on toolady.com has written blogs and books on
Yeah.
JavaScript, and he's really thorough.
The best reference, yeah.
I think he's even on the TC39 board, which is the body that works on creating the
ECMA
spec.
committee, yeah.
Yeah. So
So I'll just include this in a pipeline, like my code pipeline. I'll just add this.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yes.
that's exactly right, yeah. Whether you use gulp or grunt, or just you can use Babel on the command line without a build system around it, it all works.
you can even use Babel in Node.js.
Yes. Yep. Yeah.
So just to reiterate, he was asking if we can just add Babel or Tracer or whatever into the pipeline, and yes. So whatever your build pipeline is, whether it's gulp or grunt or whatever you're using, you can just add that right in, and it'll transpile it, and then on the backside you'll get ES5 code.
Yeah, and there's a couple more links down here, just things to look into if you're not familiar with the JavaScript developer ecosystem. ESLint's great, Node.js I'm sure everybody's heard of. It's also worth looking into.
Thanks.
Do you have any questions about JavaScript or ES6?
Yes, sir. Sure, I can talk about it. The question was a question about TypeScript. So Microsoft came out with TypeScript, and TypeScript is sort of ES6 with typing and a few other features to it. It's becoming very popular in Angular 2. It's fine if you want to use TypeScript. And if you are comfortable with ES6, and for the most part you're adding typings, there's a few other things you add into it. But yeah, it's moving along too.
Yeah.
But it's not transpiled, it's a, what do you call that? Is it transpiled?
I think it is.
It's transpiled.
It's transpiled to JavaScript, yeah.
Yes, it transpiles it down.
Yeah. I would be completely on board with TypeScript if all it added was static and strong typing to JavaScript. But I feel like they jumped the gun just a little bit on adding a module system that looks a lot like ES6's module system, but doesn't adhere to the spec completely. It just feels, it's so close. It's like the uncanny valley. Like you see TypeScript's module system and ES6 right beside each other. You're like, I don't know. They look the same, but they don't act the same. Yeah, so that's where I stand.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. Okay, so the question is there any reason to use var? over let. I've heard some people say never again. I've read some people to say, you know, if you know what it's doing, it can be useful.
Yeah. If you ask on Reddit, you get every answer you can imagine. I think let covers every case, but you can definitely find people that disagree with that.
I saw some problems with people doing it wholesale across their code base, where they were getting some weird.
Yeah, you can't just
Oh, yeah.
can't just
You
do
don't
a
wanna do that.
find replace var with let. It's gonna that changes things because the scoping is now at an inner level just based on the braces. And so you could have declared a variable inside a var inside of one of those, and then your scope's all messed up, and you didn't even realize it. So you have to do it judiciously and intelligently.
Going back to the object constructors, can you overload the constructor, or can you just turn it off?
So the question is, can you overload object constructors?
You cannot. You can insert logic that will take different actions based on the arguments that were provided, but no, there's no overloading in JavaScript. It has a little bit to do with that variable number of arguments.
Anything else?
Just random. What do you guys use to for an ID?
I use Vim.
I use several different IDEs. I use Vim when I'm just making a quick change. I've been using, I used Atom for a while, and then I've switched to WebStorm, which is IntelliJ based, but I also use JBoss Tools Eclipse. So it depends on where I'm at and what I'm focused on. I have them all. Any other questions? All right, thank you, everybody. Awesome.